Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to CBI at 10. I am Liz Mosley, editor and partner at Tortoise Media, and it's a pleasure to be here today because what else would anybody want to talk about at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning but Brexit and customs? We have a panel of very well-informed people who are, I might say, right up to their necks in it. So we've got a lot to get through, and I hope very interesting, pragmatic, useful insights about how it is going. So thank you very much to our panel and to everybody for tuning in. I'm going to start as we usually do with our CBI representative. Today is John Foster, your head of comms and policy for the CBI. Morning, John, nice to see you. Just before we get stuck into the Brexit bit of the conversation, what do we need to be aware of COVID-wise this week?
Yeah, morning, Liz. Morning, everyone. Thanks, colleagues, for joining. I hope you all had lovely long bank holiday weekends doing your bit for the UK hospitality industry, no doubt. Liz, just a few bits to update on. I will start with COVID. Lots of positive noises in the last 24 to 48 hours. So on Monday, we saw just one death from COVID and infection levels at an 8-month low. Professor Ferguson, Neil Ferguson, many of you will know as Professor Lockdown, described the data as very encouraging. Now, at the same time, this uptick in good news is unquestionably raising expectations and asking questions about just how quickly we can unlock the economy. And it's against that backdrop, Liz, that you may have seen an intervention from the CBI via our president, Lord Billamoria, over the weekend. Now, in this, we asked the government to provide greater clarity on a number of key outstanding issues. Now, these included things like working from home guidance, the use of COVID status certifications, both in a domestic and an international perspective, global travel, and in particular, further details on the traffic light system. So expecting Grant Shapps, the Transport Secretary, to make an announcement possibly on Friday around this. And then finally, on the future of social distancing in England, where all roads in Whitehall, it feels, are leading to this review being led by Michael Gove. Now, these are the 4 areas that the CBI are going to be engaging with the government over the coming weeks and months. Any thoughts, reflections, questions, please do pop them in the chat. Clearly, though, Liz, the situation in India is in a far more distressing state. Now, we've seen a huge response from UK business community to provide offers of support. Heathrow, DHL, Wincanton, Mott MacDonald, just to name just a handful, really. Now, again, we put a statement out over the weekend from Lord Billamoria, our president, asking firms that if you can help, then please do. And that can be through providing things like ventilators, oxygen cylinders, PPE, transport, logistics, all that sort of stuff. We are working, Liz, incredibly closely with our office in Delhi, with the CII, our sister federation, and of course, with the Indian High Commission, who should be your first port of call if you do want to assist. And just before I hand back to you, Liz, I'm sure Alice will share in the chat that statement from Lord Billamoria with all the types of support firms can provide and how best to follow up with contact details.
Thanks very much. Yeah, he was great on this last week as well, Lord Billamoria. So if you can look out for the links that Alice will put in the chat, and if you're able to help them, then please do put your hand up and do that. Okay, handbrake turn segue into the Brexit situation. Do you want to just tee us up a little bit, John, to sort of get us going? And then I'm going to come to Joe after that.
Yeah, I will do, Liz. Listen, I won't speak for very long because you want to hear from the experts, but let me just do a bit of scene setting. And let's start with the good news. Excuse me. So last week, we obviously saw the TCA ratified. So we have a deal. It's not a perfect deal. We might hear about why it's not a perfect deal, but it's a deal that business can and is working with. What it has done, though, Liz, is fundamentally change how the UK trades in goods, how our supply chains work. And that's really why we're talking about it today still. Now, for some of those changes, firms have been able to prepare. Leaving the customs union, for example, a long-held policy of the government. But it is the first time in decades that border processes and customs duties will have to be applied to imports and exports within the EU. Now, there have been things that businesses can prepare for, and they have been doing. We've seen them doing it. Providing extra resource for new customs documentation, stockpiling to mitigate delays. I'm sure Joe, for example, would have been doing both. The government's border operating model, published I think sometime in July last summer, also set out what those importing rules would be in this year, regardless of whether or not we had a deal. Now, it doesn't mean it's been easy, anything but. The global pandemic certainly didn't help, but it was information that firms could act on. But there are also some changes, Liz, that were a real surprise for business, changes like rules of origin. Now, these have been such a significant change for business to adapt to. They've also had a real impact on complex or international supply chains as a result of something complicated called bilateral accumulation. So what constitutes local content for the purposes of tariff-free trade? And firms have also faced real challenges of compliance with SPS checks and export health certificates. Now, these have really slowed down supply chains. They've added huge costs and burdens, particularly for smaller businesses. And it's a really big issue in Northern Ireland. And I've got no doubt Joe will talk more about this. So as a result, it's led to many businesses that we speak to asking sort of two types of questions. So firstly, they've been just reviewing their export markets. They've been simply asking, is it still worth it to export to country X? And then secondly, they've been worried and thinking about supply chains bypassing Great Britain and the impact this is going to have on our competitiveness as a global economy. Now that's the anecdotal picture. The data that we have, Liz, is actually telling a really stark picture. So the ONS trade data stats for January were at a historic low. Now in February, we saw a bit of an uptick, still a long way to go from 2019 levels. Our own surveys at the CBI have found in March and February that over 2/3 of manufacturers and distributors have seen delays at the borders. And this is due to additional custom cost and admin and that sort of thing. And then finally, Liz, in January and February this year, 20% of all SPS checks in the EU took place in Northern Ireland. 20%. Now, for context, that's a population of 2 million compared to a population of 500 million. So the data is telling us this is having a real impact. I'll just finish, Liz, on what we're doing at the CBI. So our priority is to continue to support businesses to adjust to the new relationship, but also develop policy and how it can be improved. And in fact, sort of hot off the press, I'm not sure if Alice is able to share or not, but we have a paper coming out today, 10 business priorities for EU-UK trade post-Brexit, number of ideas about how to practically improve the situation. So how can we build on the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, to simplify goods at risk, customs admin, that sort of thing. A bespoke veterinary agreement between the UK and the EU to reduce those SPS challenges that I just mentioned. And then finally, how can we really build out closer bilateral cooperation with member states and customs authorities to help smooth out some of those issues with exporting? So that's going to be our focus in the coming weeks and months, Liz. As I said, Alice will hopefully be able to share in the chat, but that's enough for me, and I'll pass back over to you so we can hear from the real experts on this piece.
Thanks ever so much, John. I'm going to start, if I can, with Joe. Joe, you head up corporate affairs for ASDA in Northern Ireland, and I could see you nodding at points when John was talking. Do you want to just briefly give us a sort of sense of where we're at now and how we got here? This has been a long old journey in terms of preparation, false starts, uncertainty. Where are we now, and how is it going, essentially?
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and good morning, everyone. Well, the first reflection is actually on the length of the journey. I mean, the referendum was 2016, and we were thinking of Brexit even before that, obviously. So 5 years later, and we're still not quite sure of the final outcome for Northern Ireland trade. We're still waiting on the UK border operating model to kick in, etc. So it has been a long haul, there's no question. I think I speak for most businesses in saying that uncertainty throughout has really been the biggest challenge for retailers, for our suppliers, and most other people across the UK. And the key thing there really is, how do you invest in solutions when the problem is still being negotiated? And that was really the key thing, you know, and we felt that acutely, particularly in 2020. And also, I would say the slow, quick, slow nature of the negotiations, you know, it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back politically, and we still ended up with cliff edges. We had an 11th hour scenario with the trade agreement that only came out on Christmas Eve, and there were £3 billion of tariffs on the table for consumers. So that was huge for retail. We had a very 11th hour scenario in the practicalities of moving goods to Northern Ireland. You know, some of the documentation came out incredibly late. We were training colleagues in depots on the 30th of December how to move goods to Northern Ireland for a 1 January deadline. So, you know, it's been a difficult process to work our way through. In the end, so far we have, I suppose we've embraced the challenge. The industry has been very agile. We've worked very well with government, with the various government departments, and our objective in retail would be to protect our customers, you know, to avoid price rises, to ensure availability and so on. And we've got through it pretty well so far. And I would say we're in a very, very critical phase now, particularly for Northern Ireland. The negotiations right now, or the discussions, I should probably call them, will determine the long-term outcome. And, you know, after 1 October, we'll either be into quite a bit of friction, or if the UK and the EU can stretch themselves now, then we could get to much more workable solutions. And John has pointed towards some of them with the CBI paper.
The interesting thing when we were talking before, Joe, when I ask a sort of layperson's question about that uncertainty and planning, given that we've still got that October sort of deadline looming on the horizon, is that, as you say, if the worst case scenario happens, you actually can't cope with that at all. So you sort of have this odd twilight zone of placing bets for sort of scenarios on a spectrum of best to worst. What's your sense of where the direction of travel is on that spectrum at the moment, or can you not say at all?
Well, I mean, there are two worlds colliding here. You have the EU with all its structures and a very thick rule book, and that rule book was written long before Brexit became a discussion point, and that has been our problem, particularly with the movement of goods to Northern Ireland. The rule book in Europe, the OCR, was never written with complex just-in-time retail supply chains in mind. So as a case study, we're moving over 200 lorries every week across to Northern Ireland from our depots in Great Britain. We've a UK model, so we treat all our customers the same. Our business would have over 40,000 product lines, and they're all available to every customer across the UK. The EU rulebook was written for commodity loads, a boatload of grain coming from South America to Europe, one export health certificate, one customs declaration, all completely absorbable into a business model. So these two things have come together, and that's where the discussion point really is now. We always bring the customer into the room, and we're talking about availability, freshness, being able to serve our stores in Northern Ireland every day. The EU have their rule book, and they want to protect the single market. So it's how we bring those two things together successfully. What I would be positive about is that there are solutions. There are ways to do this, and that's where the negotiations or the discussions are focused at the moment. Is there a possibility of a veterinary agreement? Can we make some of this digital? I think from a retailer point of view, I mean, from Asda's perspective, we're a UK only trader. We don't move goods into the single market. Our goods don't cross into the Irish Republic. So we see ourselves as absolutely no risk to the single market. So if I was in front of the European Union today, I would be saying, stretch yourself further on this. Could we have, for example, a trusted trader scheme? You know, a business like Asda would be very happy to be audited and certified, but then we could avoid the line by line paperwork and administration, which really would be quite overwhelming for us if we had to move into that beyond 1 October.
Joe, one of the things that has come up before in CBI at 10 has been how in relation to various things actually, has been how difficult it is to unpick what is a Brexit impact and what is a COVID impact. In your business as it stands right now, how does that feel? Have you got any sense of that? Because it seems to, broadly speaking, it's working okay at the moment in terms of moving stuff around and keeping the stores full and all the rest of it. Do you have a sense of those things, if you could untangle those?
Well, I think the big lesson from 2020 was the agility and the resilience of the entire food supply chain. I wouldn't single Asda out. I would say we worked very closely with government, with our suppliers. I would call out the Food Resilience Industry Forum, which was established by government, by DEFRA, where a lot of issues were tackled head on in a very collegiate way between government and the sector. And so there is a crossover with some of the issues. The ultimate objective during 2020 in a crisis essentially was to feed the nation. And we've got through that now. So hopefully we'll emerge from COVID with all the positivity that John alluded to. but it will leave us still with the Brexit issues. And the difference with the Brexit issue is that the European Union are also in the room, and we have to find ways to move this along our practical realities and serving our customers in Northern Ireland, but also meeting the EU's objective of protecting its single market. But I do see a way through. And you know, what I would hope for in the period ahead is that there is lots of engagement with the business community. I would like to see the European Union and the UK government talk to businesses like Asda and understand our supply chains. And I think the solutions lie in there. I mean, the irony is probably UK retail is the most traceable supply chain in the world. And the EU have nothing to fear from that. So it's just how we build the trust, how we bring a risk-based approach to all of this in proportionality, and then we can get towards some good solutions. At the moment, we're still at kind of base level where everything is treated as a risk, where everything goes back to the rule book, and that is very, very difficult for us to implement given the complexity and the scale of our business. We are grateful for the grace periods, I might add, which has given us the breathing space currently to just look for solutions.
Yeah, and just one final one before I bring in Jeff, if I can, Joe, and if you have questions for Joe, please do put them in the questions field, and I can ask them later on. With this sort of package of things, like you say, yourself and John have mentioned specific things that would help ameliorate, you know, the future trading position and ability to move things seamlessly and what have you. Will we have to wait for a moment when all of those things will be finally agreed together, like as we have sort of learned to do in the past, or will there be sort of sections of it that will be sort of breadcrumbed along as we go, or do we have to wait for that killer deadline?
We're not up against any particular cliff edge right now. The discussions are ongoing in the joint committee in Europe between the UK, Lord Frost, and the EU side, Maros Sefcovic. And there is a specialist committee below that that's working through the detail. The UK have submitted a work plan which envisages 4 phases beyond 1 October, where various new categories of product will face the new rules and requirements. But we're asking them to think bigger than that and think beyond just implementing in the simplest possible way the EU rulebook. Can they think outside the box and move into this wider territory of a veterinary agreement or a trusted trader scheme, and not just think about digitalization and simplification? So I suppose we just await the outcome of those discussions, Liz. Like everything else, they've rumbled along with neither side wanting to completely show their hands. I think we're a bit beyond the political now, and we're more into the practical. I've met some of the people involved in the discussions, and we're impressed by them and their pragmatism. So optimistic, but I would just finish by saying there are some really important specific things that do need to be resolved. And like any supply chain, unless you resolve every issue, then it's the small things that could really hold you up, and that is something to emphasize as well. We need a comprehensive outcome.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Joe. I'm going to come to Jeff next, if I can. We do have a third speaker who you can't see. She's lurking in the background on audio, Denise from Burberry, but she is there. I will come to Denise shortly. But Jeff, good morning. Nice to see you. Now, Jeff, you're Active Relations and Business Development for the Construction Products Association. Just describe a little bit, who is it that you represent in your association?
Sure. So we're the manufacturers and distributors of construction products. Most people, when they think of construction, they're thinking of architects or they're thinking of builders, large and small. But over a third of all the money turned over in UK construction is the companies that make the products themselves. It's the roof over your head, the floor under your feet, the windows, the paint, any number of products that goes into homes, infrastructure, in every project that involves the built environment. So it's one of the largest manufacturing sectors in the country, and yeah, we've worked closely with the CBI and some of our sister organizations in the EU, especially on some of these issues post-Brexit.
Thank you, Jeff. What have been the sort of key pressing issues for your members right now as it relates to the TCI? TCA rather?
Well, I think John and Joe have been very well spoken as far as picking up some of the very same issues that our industry has felt impacted by. We probably went into the year end from a position of strength. If you recall, the lockdown hammered just about everybody, but we were able to work closely with the government to ensure that safe operating procedures were implemented and projects large and small were able to get back up and running. So whether it was HS2 or the ability for somebody to have a boiler repairman come into their home, we were able to make that happen. What it means is that construction essentially was able to recover a lot faster than most other industries. In fact, I'd say even industry insiders were a bit surprised at how quickly it took off. Probably many of us did not anticipate how much money would be invested by people stuck at home into fixing up their flats and their gardens and whatnot, and that too helped give a boost to the industry. So that by the time we got into year end, Liz, a lot of the Brexit issues for us were around supply and demand issues, stockpiling issues, logistics issues. Would the government be ready at the border to ensure that that deliveries were made as quickly as possible? A lot of talk was focused on Dover, but the construction industry doesn't rely on roll-on, roll-off deliveries such as Dover specializes in.
Sure.
A lot of our deliveries are coming in through other ports up and down the East Coast especially, but we have a very strong domestic industry. About 75% of all the products that are used in the UK are made in the UK.
Interesting.
25% are imported, and most of that is coming from the EU. Most of that is timber related, but there are also a lot of products coming in from China, for example. And so for us, the real trick was to separate the what you were alluding to earlier, this conflating Brexit issues with what was happening around the virus. Quite frankly, I think the logistics issues at the back end of the year dissipated and were mitigated enough. We were, like Joe said, very frustrated by the lack of clarity on a lot of issues. Our members were very confused, and there was no small amount of work gone into working with the civil servants in particular to find those answers. But we've gotten to a point now where I think we're dealing essentially with a handful of real issues post Brexit because they quite frankly they were not agreed back at Christmas. The issue of UK REACH, which is a regulatory scheme that defines the use of chemicals registration and authorization. UK companies invested a lot of money over the decades making that system work in the EU. Now that we're in a post-Brexit universe, we're obliged to now create a UK version from scratch. And that has real bottom line implications for manufacturers in particular. The other big issue, and probably this is relevant to many on this call, would be the issue of marking of products. We're accustomed to CE marking of products, and this is for products that are exported from the UK into the EU market. But it's also relevant for those companies that previously would have been manufacturing on the continent and bringing products into the UK, having those products receive that mark, certifying that they were tested, certifying that they're meeting regulatory requirements. Well, that requirement was fine before Brexit, but now it's all tossed up in the air because, frankly, we don't have the kind of capacity in the UK. And I think I'd go so far as to say the scheme itself in the UK is not properly set up enough yet to allow for manufacturers to know that at the end of 2021, they can put their product safely on the market and trust that they are still meeting the obligations as this government sets out. So there are questions around whether all these products that previously had a CE mark will now be able to get a CA mark in time for them to remain on the market. You were talking about worst case scenarios to Joe, and I think for us, worst case scenario means it's very possible. In fact, we're already hearing from some companies, some manufacturers, both in the UK and in Europe, that they cannot be certain that they will have the necessary CA mark, the British mark, on their products, and therefore they are already making decisions about pulling their products from the UK market. So maybe this means an architect who's accustomed to having a certain product will no longer have access to it. Or maybe repairs of certain kinds of projects are suddenly more expensive because those kind of products that were previously used are no longer available, and we have to go find something else. This is probably the burning issue, especially for manufacturers. And we're very fortunate because we can leverage the strength of the CBI with these kind of arguments with the policymakers who I think up to this time have struggled to get their head around it. It's, I think there's a British phrase for it. It's a very wonkish kind of argument. It's like for anoraks, yeah? It's very complex. Even for experts, we've been in the room with plenty of experts around the table, and it is full of complications and trip hazards. So it's something that needs addressing, and needs addressing quickly in order to give these companies the certainty and the advance warning they need.
So Jeff, that's interesting. In relation specifically to the CA mark, I can only imagine, the mind boggles how complex that is going to be going from one to the other. The deadline as it stands that you know needs to be extended is when? Is that the end of this year?
The end of this year, Liz, that's right. So so essentially, in very brutal terms, essentially, if you don't have your product marked with this new British mark by the end of the year, you will be legally liable and at risk if you decide to put your product on the market. And what we're asking of government is essentially, much as probably Joe is familiar with, the idea of a grace period, the idea of being able to extend this deadline, perhaps at least a year, to allow that bottleneck to relieve itself, and for us to be able to work with governments. And frankly, what we also need is Lord Frost's support with the EU, and the EU's support in order to recognize this is an issue that that involves both parties and could have real world implications for EU companies also.
Fascinating and terrifying, Jeff. Thank you very much. I would love to hear from perhaps people watching this morning who maybe are caught in that bottleneck, and how you're thinking about expediting the process for your own organisations, or if you need support or help or advice or guidance from either Jeff's association or indeed the CBI. I'd be interested to hear from you. I'm going to bring in now our mystery caller, who is Denise Vallon-Alvarez. You're Director of Global Trade Compliance for Burberry, an iconic British brand, if I may say. Are you there, Denise? Can you hear me?
I can, and thanks for the invite to the CBI, and apologies that I am the disembodied voice. Hopefully there's a picture of some sort on camera, so I'm not a complete shock to everybody.
It's great to hear you this morning, Denise, and thank you so much for making the time. So in the context of your role, you obviously, Burberry, I called it a British brand. I think it's fair to say that it is, but obviously you're a global company. You trade all over the world. I can only imagine what you're coping with at the moment. How much, if we go back to, you mentioned that the TCA was your little Christmas present that you received on the 24th of December, was it, last year? What a lovely treat to find in your stocking. How much were you at Burberry able to prepare before that hit, and what did you have to particularly adapt?
So it's a really good question. I mean, to be honest, it's important to put context here that as a business, we took a really active approach cross-functionally to the concept of Brexit, and we were able to, as you mentioned, we were a global business, to use our experience of other EU and global FTAs to inform that experience. So setting up working groups in the business and the steering committee for decision making cross-functionally, which really brought us together. We kept on top of a lot of the updates, and where possible fed into the government working groups. So things like the border operating model and so on, we were able to, really dissect that and try to understand. We did make a series of, I'd say, informed assumptions and preemptive planning decisions of no regret on things such as stock planning and rebalancing, setting up specific logistics flows, pivoting to using different types of freight lanes and types of freight. So in advance of it being finalised. And I think the other thing that often doesn't get mentioned here is the IT system changes and adjustments around countries of origin you need to think about. And we do have a customs warehouse in Italy. And so those system changes as well was something that was in our fore. I mean, we pre-planned as much as we could, but as much as we could. There's also this aspect of talking about being a global supply chains. We work with our suppliers for manufactured products, peripherals such as IT equipment, which sometimes people don't think about, but businesses often move IT equipment around the world. Just to ensure that everybody was clear on requirements. From a practical perspective, we tried to mitigate any potential issues on supply chain, organising stock to be in country as of January for retail, which is a really important month.
Yeah.
Moving to dedicated vehicles and so on. There's also running simulations. We really took a sort of belt and braces approach to things that we thought might happen, and then when the border operating model was published, to embedding our understanding of how that would work. I think you asked a really interesting question earlier when we were talking offline about FTAs, and it's quite important that we talk about how dealing with a customs and tax perspective, we put into place appropriate customs clearance facilities and ways of working. So EORI numbers and VAT numbers. We built a lot around the working assumptions that no FTA was a possibility or a minimal mutual recognition arrangement. So we were trying to cover as many bases as we were given to understand from some of the guidance would be necessary or we could see might be useful, but nobody can know everything.
Yeah, indeed. And even now, I guess you sort of have to deal with the reality as it's presented now in the knowledge that things will still evolve and change. I'm interested, and this is, I've thought this a couple of times actually on previous webinars when we've talked about Brexit at various points in the process, that broadly speaking, people who represent businesses are sort of quite pragmatic. I won't say they're not sort of Pollyanna-ish about it in any way, but they're sort of, well, you know, we're doing our best to cope and we've put this in place and we're managing to cover this and this hasn't been as bad as we thought. Broadly speaking, that's the vibe. I'm just wondering, since the TCA came into force for Burberry, how has it actually impacted your supply chains and customs processes? What has been the fallout from that?
I mean, we've talked about the fact that it was a Christmas present. But I would say that we were really grateful to have pre-planned, but as I said, we can't plan for everything. So we did experience delays in both directions across the border. Because of that short period of adjustment, you know, that did bring challenges to the readiness for partners as well, because, you know, this is a chain. Yeah. I mean, there are fewer easements for EU imports, and it became clear that there were issues in some countries with the processes of customs clearance, whether due to newer workforce or a lack of system capacity or availability. So those were things that perhaps for businesses are kind of beyond one's control. I mean, in the UK, there were easements and our own preparations and logistics changes had allowed us to manage imports more successfully, along with a close working relationship with our providers and our brokers. Flows into EU more challenging to the local domestic regulations in some countries, which can go above and beyond the UCC, the Uniform Customs Code, and we weren't and perhaps weren't immediately obvious during planning. So as things came up, there was a need to resolve issues in a real time, and continue to do so because that's the nature of business. I mean, something that John mentioned earlier about the rules of origin and accumulation, dare I say, it's something far too close to my heart. Fashion and rules of origin for textiles are considered one of the toughest to comply with. So getting our heads around those, they're very complex. Mostly some of them are historically complex, but some are complex due to the way that raw materials move around to make goods, and so those can be very detailed. So there's also the need to look at how you can use the FTA effectively. So this wasn't just and potential increases in duty, but also you've got clear increases in customs clearance costs just to make entries. So we have had to expand our trade compliance team to accommodate the greater amounts of clearance, but also administrative management of FTA preference under the new arrangement. It was not plain sailing, but we implemented a daily cross-functional working group to manage the real time. Effectively, as each member state had definitely tackled changes in a different manner, solutions sometimes had to be more country specific than perhaps people might suppose.
Denise, are you still there? I can't tell if
Yeah,
you're.
Yeah, no, definitely here.
That's I heard a frightening sound that sounded like you were like. I just wondered. So you had your lovely Christmas present, and then you hit January the 1st, and it's like, okay, here we go. I just wonder, in the sort of, what are we now? Early May, 4 months and a bit that we've been living in the new world. Has it broadly got better? Has it got worse? Is it just the same? You know, have you learned anything new that has been a surprise about how things have materialized? How has it sort of evolved?
And it is an evolution. I think we've definitely seen an improvement as we've adjusted the processes, you know, as Jo said at the beginning, to deal with the new way of working, but also partners and authorities have also embedded their processes because there's a learning curve for everybody. Nevertheless, we've taken a cautious phasing approach to the use of groupage, for example, so that's multiple different people in one truck, multiple different declarants. We have started a program to embed a customs warehouse within our current distribution site, for example, to deal more effectively with duty management, particularly when it comes to preserving preferential origin. Like all business, we do have some outstanding open topics, which I think Jeff referred to earlier, as did Jo, which we're working through. And as product diversifies, and this is a really important point that Jeff mentioned earlier about the regulatory space, we now have an increase in regulatory requirements to contend with, as despite the agreement, local domestic laws across member states do differ, and that's quite important because perhaps people might not be necessarily aware, but to give you some very brief examples, for example, Italian health certification law related to products containing down is very Italian specific. You don't find the same regulation in other member states. And then Spain has very specific health requirements on beauty and sunglass imports, to name but a couple. So when you're looking at bringing new products into a market, I would say that if people take away anything, don't make the assumption that everything is exactly the same across all member states, because there are domestic regulations for certain products. So that's quite important for people to now add into their thoughts, not just around the UKCA, which Jeff explained so eloquently, but also just the need to consider the product from a wider perspective than just that border.
Fascinating. I love that Spain has particular requirements on sunglasses imports. I mean, whoever said that fashion wasn't glamorous? I could wonk for sure about Spanish requirements for sunglasses imports, definitely. Thanks so much, Denise. It's fascinating to hear and really understand the sort of workings of a business like Burberry. I think it's fascinating. I'm going to come back to Jeff, if I may, because there's a point made in the chat by somebody who's watching along, Steve Morley from a company called CBM, about steel safeguarding. And Steve's point is steel safeguarding is a major issue because of Brexit, with the safeguarding rules transferring to the UK, which are out of date or affected by recent events, which are now impacting on steel supply to construction. Jeff, is that something you're aware of from your members? Do you want to respond a little bit to that comment or expand a little bit on it, perhaps? Oh, we can't hear you, Jeff.
Sorry, at the risk of spinning off into another wonkish discussion, what I will say is, yes, we are familiar with it, and it's very relevant to construction product manufacturers. Essentially, there are some real issues about whether there are quotas involved with certain kind of steel products that might actually force supply shortages. We know that there's huge demand globally for steel. China especially came out of the virus recovery much sooner than everybody else, and so drove a huge demand, and as well as for other products. And we're certainly seeing shortages here in the UK, Liz. I think for the moment we have some hope that the the regulations around steel numbers and importing numbers will be enough to get us through the pinch points I spoke about earlier. But yes, I invite your guests there to contact me, and we can take that offline.
Great, thank you very much. Jeff, while I'm talking to you, I'm going to come back to Joe in a sec. Are there opportunities? You sort of talked about the CA marking thing, which sounds terrifying, honestly. But are there opportunities arising from Brexit for your members, or is it a sort of broadly a net negative?
That's a tough one. I think my knee-jerk reaction is to say it's difficult to find one. However, I suppose one thing that Brexit and the virus forced upon our industry, at least UK construction as a whole, is that it had to work much more collaboratively, much more cohesively. It typically is known for working in silos, builders against architects, against manufacturers. It's known to be very antagonistic, very contractual. This has forced a different mindset, and to take that mindset outside the country, we've spoken with DIT and worked with DIT, for example, that's international trade, to address some of those opportunities, like whether the expertise gained from the 2012 games can now be transferred to the Pan American Games in Peru, and that contract actually is well underway. And with this new view of working together and recognizing the strengths of British construction expertise, we hope to get companies plugged in ways that they weren't before. So that's probably the easiest answer, Liz.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. We've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to come back to Joe for sort of closing thoughts. Joe, I'm going to do the horrible thing, which is to ask you, given everything that you've been through on the 5 years plus journey and the highs and lows, or mainly lows, but possibly, if you were going to advise people watching today, there's been a question come in, for example, of somebody who's wondering, broadly speaking, is the advice that you focus on adapting to the new rules now rather than waiting for what might happen in the future? What is the sort of key thing that you could offer up to other kinds of companies, large and small, on this ongoing pleasure cruise of Brexit?
I think the reason people are asking that is because the Brexit journey has been unprecedented in terms of uncertainty. And that's why we're all thinking, should we have done something differently? Was our plan really as strong as it could have been? And I think in 10 years' time, when we look back, we'll go, do you know what? We were actually in an impossible position because the goalposts kept moving so much. And if you planned for the worst, you know, that's so vast and so huge, it's probably actually beyond a lot of businesses' capabilities to plan for the absolute worst. We can think through the mitigations. We've still all that work to do. What I would say about the Northern Ireland Protocol is there's basically an upside and a downside. The downside is the movement of goods GB to NI. So to borrow a phrase from Monsieur Barnier, you know, can we de-dramatize that? That's where the focus needs to be.
Yeah.
And if we do, we can get to the upside. And the upside is Northern Ireland being able to uniquely trade into Britain and into Europe. And there are massive opportunities there. So really, all of us, even as individual businesses, keep talking to the policymakers and keep highlighting those commercial opportunities and realities, and that'll hopefully move them to a good place.
Thanks ever so much. Wise words from Joe. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us this morning. Of course, to the mystery voice, Denise, who was absolutely brilliant on the phone. To John, Joe and Jeff. Sounds like a boy band, John, Joe and Jeff. It's been a completely fascinating conversation this morning. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned loads. Next week on Monday, we return to the topic which we've talked about a couple of times, which is about mental health and how that is affecting people and businesses. And then a week today, we are going to look at where we are on reopening from a global perspective. So COVID impact around the world and how it will affect UK businesses in particular. So if you are able to, please do join us for that. Thank you very much for your time this morning. As I always say, go and put the kettle on, take 5 minutes before you open your emails. Thank you so much to everybody for your time this morning. Have a good day. Bye.